In most countries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was very stigmatizing to have a child out of wedlock. There weren't really any effective forms of contraception at the time, and abortions were not only unsafe, but also illegal. Abandoning or killing the unwanted baby was of course also a criminal offense and could get you hanged. Unwed mothers in the UK who kept the baby would not only be shamed, but they would also struggle to provide for themselves and the child because of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which established that the fathers of illegitimate children had no financial obligation to provide for them. In many countries, laws regulating adoption didn't exist until around the 1920s or 30s, so both people who wanted to give up as well as adopt a baby relied on the services of baby farmers. Baby farmers were usually, but not always, women who would accept custody of an unwanted child in exchange for either a periodic or lump sum payment. The amount charged would usually depend on the class of the person giving up the baby. If they were wealthy, the baby farmer would usually request a larger payment. If the person was poor, the baby farmer would ask for a far lower rate. The expected role of the baby farmer was to care for the child until either the mother was ready to take back custody or until the baby could be adopted out to live with another family. The baby farmer would usually also charge money to anyone wanting to adopt a baby, and this could be a sum of anywhere between $10,000 to $10,000. However, some baby farmers realized that it was a lot easier and more profitable when they didn't have to spend much of their payment actually caring for the baby. Many would neglect the babies and leave them starving and in unsanitary conditions. Some baby farmers even began killing the babies after receiving payment, either by fatal neglect or methods such as strangulation. There were a few factors that made this almost the perfect crime. In an era of high infant mortality, it's inevitable that a few of the infants would pass away from various illnesses or epidemic diseases. This also meant that infant deaths wouldn't attract very much attention because they were so common. Also, if the baby that was supposedly rehomed seemed to have disappeared completely, the mother was usually too afraid to go to the police for help because of the shame surrounding being an unmarried mother. Although baby farming was the most common in Victoria-era Britain, there are over 100 documented cases of baby farmers turned serial killers all around the world. In this video, I'll discuss a few of these cases. Let's start with the case of Margaret Waters, who was the first baby farmer to be convicted for murder in Britain. Margaret was born in Brixton in 1835. Not much is known about her early life, but it's said that she began baby farming in 1864 to support herself after her husband passed away. He'd left her £300, and she said that while she tried to make an honest living, she quickly fell into debt. At first, she would take in women who were being confined due to pregnancy. At the time, it was considered distasteful for an upper-class or unwed woman to be in public while being obviously pregnant. After giving birth, many women would also rest in bed for a few weeks to recover. So Margaret would allow these confined women to stay with her and then take in their unwanted children for a fee. She eventually was responsible for caring for 4 children, and the financial burden was becoming too much. Margaret then began putting advertisements in newspapers offering her baby farming services, where she claimed that she would take in a child for £10, which was a lot of money at the time. After receiving the payment, she would take the child to other women who were advertising themselves as wet nurses and pay for their services for 2 weeks in advance. They generally didn't ask for information like her address, so she would just never come back for the baby and pocket the leftover money. This ended up being very unsustainable, so Margaret decided to visit a moneylender and borrow £28, which she was expected to pay back in smaller installments. However, when she had late payments, the moneylender threatened to take all of her belongings unless she paid an extra fine. Unsurprisingly, by the time she'd finished paying off her initial loan, she was in an even worse position than before, and she felt obligated to take another loan from the lender. At this point, she was still baby farming, and many of the parents who paid her to take in and care for their children were wealthy. Margaret said that the babies were well dressed when they were given to her, and she was receiving up to £20 for the care of one baby. The children in Margaret's custody were cared for as best as she could, according to her. If they were sick, a doctor would provide medical care, and if they passed away due to illness, she would give them a proper burial. But being so impoverished, she couldn't keep up this standard of care. Margaret said that this is when she realized that she needed to get rid of the children. She stated that one by one, she would take the babies into the streets and look for children playing. When she spotted one, she would call them over and say, "I am so tired. Here, hold my baby, and here is 6 pence for you to go into the sweet stuff shop and get something nice." Once the child went into the candy store, Margaret would run off, leaving the baby behind. She claims that she was almost caught doing this on one occasion when the child was served so quickly in the shop that she didn't have time to get away. She scurried into an oyster shop and watched as the little boy holding the baby looked for her. He didn't see her and began to cry, attracting a crowd until a police officer eventually came to help. The officer took the baby from the boy, and Margaret made her way home without being caught. She believed that these babies were taken to the workhouse. For reference, workhouses in the Victorian era were a place for impoverished people to live where they earned their keep by working. They also housed people such as orphans, unwed mothers, and disabled people, and as you can probably imagine, the conditions there were not very desirable. Now, what I just outlined for you was Margaret's claims about what happened. However, the testimony from Margaret's 14-year-old maid named Ellen tells a different story. According to Ellen, Margaret would feed the children a concoction made of brandy, arrowroot, milk, and water, with a small amount of a strange lime substance added to all but one baby's drink. The baby who didn't get any of the lime substance turned out to be the child of Margaret's sister. Ellen began noticing that the children who consumed the lime substance began to look very sick and frail, and they started to suffer illnesses like convulsions. On several occasions, Ellen witnessed Margaret and her sister leaving the home late at night with one of the children. When she asked what was going on, Margaret's explanation was that the children were too sick for her to take care of them, so they had to be brought back home. Ellen said that she never saw any of these children again, but she did occasionally see some of the clothing that they were wearing when she was at the workhouse. One of these children was John Walter Cohen, a 6-week-old baby that Margaret had taken in exchange for £4. John was born to a 16-year-old unmarried girl in a lying-in establishment, which is where pregnant women could go for confinement. A police sergeant named Richard Ralph had been staking out the building and traced John's adoption to Margaret's home, where he found 7 sick babies lying in extremely unsanitary conditions. He arrested Margaret for willful neglect, and the babies in her care were moved to a workhouse. 6 of these 7 babies died there shortly after, including John. In her statement, Ellen said that she was shocked when she found the body of John Walter Cohen, referred to as Little Cohen, in the workhouse. She recognized him because he'd been in the care of Margaret and she'd interacted with him on a few occasions. While 6 babies had died, Margaret was only arrested and charged for the murder of John Walter Cohen because his grandfather was the only person willing to testify against her. Margaret herself admitted that 5 babies had died in her custody, and she claimed this was due to natural causes. However, the doctor who performed the autopsies determined that their deaths were due to extreme malnourishment and an overdose of narcotics. An examination of the bodies determined that Margaret was adding laudanum and paregoric elixir to their bottles. Laudanum is a tincture of opium, and it contains most of the opioid alkaloids such as codeine and morphine. Paregoric elixir is also a tincture of opium, and they were both often used as painkillers and antispasmodics at the time. In Margaret's case, these drugs were used to suppress the baby's appetite so that they would slowly starve to death. While there are 6 confirmed deaths of infants dying after being in her care, it's speculated that she killed as many as 19. News articles from the time speculate that she would wrap their bodies in brown paper before simply dumping them in the streets. Sadly, this was a fairly common sight at the time, due to both the high infant mortality rate as well as the high cost of burial. After this came to light, Margaret was charged and convicted of 5 counts of willful murder, conspiracy, neglect, and the murder of John Walter Cohen. While awaiting her execution, Margaret requested to write her own statement of her case to defend herself. In this statement, she claimed that she didn't intentionally murder any of the children in her care. She produced receipts showing medical care for some of the sick children, as well as receipts from the undertaker of some proper burials. She also showed evidence of her purchasing daily milk deliveries to feed the babies. Her defense as to why the conditions that the babies lived in were so filthy was that she was afraid to bathe them because she didn't want to make them even more sick. She also wrote that the parents of these illegitimate children deserved more blame than she did, because they wanted to get rid of their baby any way that they could. Her reasoning was that if there were no parents seeking to adopt out their baby to avoid shame, then baby farmers wouldn't have to exist. On October 11th of 1870, 35-year-old Margaret Waters was hung. She was the first person to receive a death sentence for baby farming in the UK. The next case of baby farming that I'll share with you is that of Amelia Dyer. She's considered not only the most prolific baby farmer killer of Victoria-era Britain, but one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Amelia Dyer was born as Amelia Hobley in 1838 in Pyle Marsh, near Bristol. She was the youngest of 5 siblings born into a wealthy family. At a young age, she had the privilege of learning to read and write, leading to a love of poetry and literature. However, when her mother contracted typhus, Amelia's childhood began to go downhill. After getting sick, her mother would often have violent raving fits and beat her children. She was obligated to care for her mother until her death when Amelia was 10 years old. After her mother passed away, Amelia moved in with her aunt who lived in Bristol, and she eventually began an apprenticeship with a corset maker. Her father passed away when she was 21 years old. 3 years later, Amelia had a falling out with at least one of her brothers, leading to her becoming permanently estranged. She moved into a common lodging house where she met her future husband, George Thomas. They were married soon after. At the time, she was 24 years old and he was 59, so they lied on their marriage certificate to deduct 11 years from his age and add 6 years to hers to make the age gap seem far smaller. After her marriage to George, Amelia trained as a nurse for several years. This is where she got in contact with a midwife named Ellen Dane who introduced her to the concept of baby farming, where she could accept payment in exchange for custody of a child and either let them die due to neglect or adopt them out to make an even bigger profit. Amelia was immediately intrigued because it was a far easier job than being a nurse and it could be very profitable. Soon after, she gave birth to her daughter Ellen Thomas, and then she had to leave her job as a nurse. Then, in 1869, George Thomas passed away. This is when Amelia began letting unwed pregnant women stay in confinement at her home and then accepting a payment to care for their babies. She would request a substantial one-time fee and clothing for the infant. She advertised herself as a loving, respectable married woman with nursing training who could provide excellent care for a child. It wasn't long after Amelia began baby farming that the murders began. She too would neglect the infants and let them slowly starve while using a mixture of syrup and opium known as mother's friend to keep them sedated and quiet. Eventually, she realized that she could avoid this lengthy process by simply killing the baby almost immediately after receiving payment. While carrying out her crimes, Amelia got married to a man named William Dyer in 1872. They had 2 children together, a daughter named Mary Ann who went by Polly, and a son named William. Amelia got away with the murders for a long time. It wasn't until 1879 when she finally attracted suspicion from a doctor who was concerned about the number of infant deaths he'd been asked to certify at Amelia's home. However, she wasn't charged with murder, but rather neglect, and her sentence was 6 months of hard labor. While this was a relatively lenient sentence at the time, Amelia claimed that it was incredibly detrimental to her mental health. Once she completed her sentence, she tried to get back into her career as a nurse. She had frequent stays in mental hospitals due to mental instability and suicidal ideation, which would frequently occur at times when she was attracting suspicion for the deaths of babies in her care. It's been suggested that her training as a nurse taught her how to behave to ensure that she would be placed in a mental asylum whenever she wanted. However, it's also possible that her instability was real and could have been due to her alcohol and opioid abuse, which began around the time her baby farming career did. In 1890, Amelia was in trouble with the law again while caring for the illegitimate child of a governess. When the governess came for a visit, she was suspicious of the baby's identity and checked their hip for a birthmark, which wasn't there. This, as well as Amelia already being a target of suspicion for authorities, caused her to have or possibly pretend to have a mental breakdown. She attempted suicide by drinking 2 bottles of laudanum, but survived due to her high tolerance because of long-term abuse. Amelia was now realizing that she wouldn't get away with the murders if she kept involving doctors to sign death certificates. She continued to kill the babies in her care, but she would dispose of the bodies herself. This didn't rid her of suspicion though, so she and her family would frequently use aliases and relocate to different cities to avoid both the authorities as well as parents who were trying to reclaim their child. Her last stay in a mental hospital was in 1893, and it was apparently a very poor experience that left her never wanting to go back. In 1895, Amelia moved to Berkshire along with a woman named Jane Smith, referred to as Granny Smith, who she'd met after a brief stay in a workhouse. Amelia's daughter Polly and her son-in-law joined them. Amelia convinced Jane to join her when meeting women to receive custody of a child, because she felt that having the older woman there gave the impression of an innocent and caring mother-daughter relationship. In 1896, a 25-year-old unwed woman in Cheltenham named Evelina Marmon gave birth to a daughter named Doris. She placed an advertisement in the paper seeking a woman to take care of a child with the expectation of being able to regain custody once she'd saved up enough money from working. Coincidentally, Evelina saw an advertisement right next to hers from a woman named Mrs. Harding, which was one of Amelia's aliases. Mrs. Harding was seeking to adopt a child in exchange for being paid £10. Evelina replied to this advertisement, and she received a response that said, "I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own. We are plain, homely people in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort. Myself and my family are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." Despite the fee being expensive, Evelina was desperate to get back to work and she agreed to a one-time payment. She met up with Mrs. Harding a week later. Evelina was initially a bit taken aback at Amelia's appearance because she'd expected someone younger. However, she felt that Amelia seemed affectionate and kind, so she paid the fee and handed over her daughter Doris and a box of clothing. Amelia claimed that she and Doris would be going back home to Reading, and the distressed Evelina said goodbye. A few days after Evelina returned home, she got a letter from Amelia who said that Doris was doing well. Evelina replied, but she never received an answer from Amelia. In actuality, Amelia hadn't taken Doris to Reading. She actually went to London, where her daughter Polly was currently staying. Shortly after arriving, Amelia strangled Doris with dressmaker's tape. It was unfortunately a slow death because Amelia enjoyed watching the babies suffer. Afterwards, Amelia and Polly used a napkin to wrap up Doris's body before packing up most of the clothes from Evelina to be sold to a pawn shop. Amelia also gave a pair of children's boots as a gift to the landlady, which may have been from this box. A day later, Amelia returned to the home after picking up another baby named Henry Simmons. Sadly, he too was strangled, and both of their bodies were placed into a bag with some bricks. Amelia tossed this bag into the River Thames thinking that she'd committed the perfect crime. But unbeknownst to her, a package containing the body of a baby girl had actually been fished from the river a month earlier. The girl was eventually identified as Helena Fry. The detective working on the case used a microscope to analyze the paper that the body was wrapped in, and he was able to make out the name Mrs. Thomas and an address that led them to where Amelia lived with her daughter and son-in-law. This furthered the police suspicion of Amelia, but they felt that they didn't have enough evidence to arrest her for the crime. They continued to gather evidence from eyewitnesses and other police departments and placed her house under surveillance. Their plan was to have a young woman pose as an expecting mother seeking someone to take in her child as a way of connecting Amelia to the crime. When Amelia opened the door, she expected to see a young mother standing there with her baby. Instead, she was face to face with a group of detectives. Then, on April 3rd of 1896, the police raided her home. They didn't find any bodies, but the house apparently smelled strongly of decomposition and there was plenty of other evidence, like the tape used to strangle her victims, as well as letters from mothers who were concerned about the well-being of their children. The police determined that in the past few months, Amelia had taken in a minimum of 20 children. Based on this number, it's been estimated that her total number of victims throughout the duration of her career as a baby farmer was around 400 to 500. The day after the raid, Amelia was arrested and charged with murder. Her daughter's husband was also charged as an accessory to murder. The river was searched shortly afterwards and 6 more bodies were found, each strangled with the same tape. Amelia told the police that this was how they could identify that a baby was one of hers. At the inquest into the murders, the police couldn't provide evidence that either Amelia's daughter Polly or her son-in-law had any involvement in the killings. In a written confession, Amelia stated that she was solely to blame for her crimes and they had no involvement, so the charges against her daughter's husband were dropped. Amelia pled guilty to the murder of Doris Marmon, and her acquaintances and even some family members testified against her, including her daughter. The evidence given was damning, especially because Amelia's only defense was to plead insanity. This proved unsuccessful because the prosecution argued that her stays in mental hospitals only occurred when she was worried about being caught. After only 4 minutes of deliberation, Amelia was found guilty by a jury and she was sentenced to death. In the weeks leading up to her execution, she filled 5 books with confessions of her crimes. At 57 years old, she was hung on June 10th of 1896. After the scandal of Amelia's case, adoption laws were made stricter in the UK and police had more authority to investigate baby farms. They would also look into people placing advertisements for adoption in the newspapers. However, this didn't do much to stop the abuse and commodified adoptions of babies, which continued for many years. Even after formal adoption agencies became more common, baby farmers continued to covertly adopt, abuse, and traffic babies. This brings us to the case of the last documented baby farm murders, which took place in Canada. This one's a little different from the previous cases because it was technically an unlicensed maternity home. The Life and Health Sanatorium was opened in 1928 by William Peach Young and his wife Lila Gladys Young. William was a chiropractor and an unordained minister, and Lila was a midwife. Together, the couple had 5 children. They began working out of their 4-bedroom cottage, and in the beginning they were barely able to scrape together enough money for cots for their patients. Lila began delivering babies at the home, and about a year after opening, they renamed it the Ideal Maternity Home. The home claimed to offer discreet maternity care such as private birthing, as well as placements for children of unmarried mothers. At the time, war created many dislocations in the area, which led to increasing numbers of pregnant women seeking help. The fees for their services were astronomical. They required up to a $500 payment on arrival for their maternity services, which would be about $7,800 today if adjusted for inflation. This is especially high when you consider that the average weekly income at the time was only about $8, which would be $125 today. There were also additional fees such as babysitting fees and burial fees. William and Lila justified their prices by guaranteeing privacy and discretion. The mothers were also required to sign a contract that signed over the custody of their child to William. If they didn't do this within 14 days of the baby being born, they would get charged an additional $30. William and Lila would sell the infants in their care for up to $10,000, which would come to a total of $156,000 today. They disguised these payments as donations to the home. The main focus of William and Lila's advertising was on people in New York and New Jersey in the United States. This is because many couples there desired to adopt a baby, but they couldn't due to factors like state laws. There were eventually about 80 to 125 babies in their care at any given time, and throughout their 18 years of operation, approximately 800 to 1,500 babies were born at the Ideal Maternity Home. It was the largest maternity home in eastern Canada at the time. By 1933, William and Lila had paid off the mortgage on the maternity home, bought several cars, and built themselves a new 3-story, 9-bedroom house. They also continued to expand the Ideal Maternity Home, and it went from 4 bedrooms to 54 by 1943. William and Lila had many supporters, including prominent politicians, so they were able to continue operating like this for years. They were often praised for helping unwed mothers escape shame and for housing and providing new homes for the unwanted babies. Additionally, their supporters praised them because the maternity home's adoption arrangements made it so that they didn't have to pay taxes to support the unwed mothers. However, not everyone was pleased with the Ideal Maternity Home. In 1934, the Nova Scotia Department of Public Welfare gathered evidence that the high fees exploited the unwed mothers, as well as that the standards of care in the home were extremely poor with regards to nutrition, cleanliness, and medical care. William and Lila were also accused of using fraudulent methods like blackmail to collect payments, as well as selling babies on the black market. Unfortunately, the Nova Scotian child welfare system didn't have the power to shut down the maternity home, and the officials were left to continue gathering evidence against William and Lila. However, the pressure was successful in forcing them to hire a registered nurse to work at the home. In 1935, they were charged and convicted of fraud after they continued to collect payments for a child that had died in their care. A year later, they were also charged with 2 counts of manslaughter after the death of a mother and a baby at the home, but they were acquitted. They operated without a license for 17 years until the Maternity Boarding House Act was amended in 1940 and they had to apply for a license. They were turned down for this and ordered to close in 1945. Evidence was also found that they were overstating their medical qualifications, but the government didn't prosecute them for this offense. Then, in 1946, they were convicted on 7 violations of the Maternity Boarding Houses Act. As a result, William and Lila renamed the home to the Battle Creek of Nova Scotia Rest Haven Park, but they continued their birthing and adoption services despite being embroiled in several court cases. This is when child welfare services in both Canada and the United States began to more strictly investigate the illegal cross-border adoptions. William and Lila tried to get around this crackdown on their illegal adoptions by making the birth mothers take their babies to the United States with them. This strategy proved unsuccessful, and shortly afterwards they claimed that the maternity home was closing so that they could open a hotel instead. Around this time, an article by Mavis Gallant was published in the Montreal Standard newspaper that exposed the exploitation and bullying of young women by William and Lila, their involvement in international child trafficking, and the poor medical care offered at the home. This led to them losing many of their previous supporters, and William and Lila attempted to sue for defamation. Not only were they unsuccessful, but the trial also revealed the horrifying truth that there were numerous dead infants buried on the property in butter boxes instead of coffins. There's of course no evidence to suggest that William and Lila murdered any of these babies themselves, but the poor conditions at the home were likely responsible for many of these infant deaths. After this trial, William and Lila ended up bankrupt and they quickly left Nova Scotia. A monument to the babies born at the home was established in 1997. Now, some of the survivors of the Ideal Maternity Home from across Canada, the United States, and Europe continue to try and reach their loved ones. There's a website aimed at helping survivors connect with their families, and it also has some photos of people who are reunited with their birth families. There are so many more cases of baby farmers who cause the deaths of children for profit, and I can't get to all of them in this video. If you're interested in reading more about this topic, I'd suggest looking up the cases of Frances Knorr and Jesse King. There's also a book about the Ideal Maternity Home called Butterbox Babies, which is a sad but informative read. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave them down below. I also want to say a huge thank you for 1,000 subscribers. This is a huge milestone and I'm so happy you guys enjoy my videos. To celebrate, the next video I'll be doing is one that's been requested quite a few times. I hope I'll see you there.